Hey guys, tonight we're not just diving into history, we're descending into the dark, chaotic belly of a wooden warship during a brutal 18th century sea battle. Forget the swashbuckling heroes and the glorious naval victories. Tonight, we're focusing on a figure whose survival depended on chaos. A person whose job got exponentially harder and terrifying when the cannons roared the ship's carpenter. Imagine yourself down there, deep below decks, in the suffocating darkness, with tons of exploding timber and iron all around you. You'd probably not last 5 minutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to, say, the early 1800s, perhaps aboard a sturdy American frigate like the USS Constitution, just before the fateful engagement that would earn her the nickname Old Ironsides. The air down here, in the dimly lit bowels of the ship, smells of tar, old wood, and a faint hint of bilge water. You are the ship's carpenter, a vital, often unsung member of the crew. Your hands are calloused, your muscles hardened by years of wielding axes, adzes, and mallets. You know every creak and groan of this massive wooden beast, every joint, every plank, every crucial timber. This ship, in a very real sense, is your second skin, and you are its bone doctor. Before the chaos, your life aboard was one of constant vigilance and skilled maintenance. You'd be inspecting the mast steps, checking the integrity of the bulkheads, ensuring the decks weren't leaking like a sieve. You were responsible for everything from mending splintered oars to patching small holes in the hull from rough weather. Your world was one of measurements, plumb lines, and the rhythmic rasp of a saw. You were a craftsman, a structural engineer, and a general handyman all rolled into one. It was like being the head contractor for a massive, floating wooden building that was constantly trying to fall apart. Your workspace is usually on the lower deck or even the orlop deck, a dark, cramped space filled with your tool saws, chisels, hammers, mallets, and most importantly, your oakum and lead patches. Oakum, a material made from tarred hemp fibers, is crucial for sealing leaks, and lead patches are your go-to for quick, temporary fixes to splintered planks. Around you are stacks of spare timber, coils of rope, and the quiet sounds of a ship at sea, the creak of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the distant shouts of sailors above. It's a peaceful, methodical existence, punctuated by the occasional emergency repair from a storm. But then, the alarm sounds. The drums beat the call to quarters, a frantic, urgent rhythm that pulses through the very timbers of the ship. The serene world you knew moments ago shatters. You hear the thud of bare feet on decks above, the shouted orders, the frantic clearing of lines. This isn't a drill, this is it. An enemy ship, bristling with cannons, has been sighted. Your stomach clenches, a knot of dread tightening in your gut. You're not a gunner, not a boarder. Your battle station is not on the open deck, but deep inside this wooden leviathan, where the true horror of naval warfare is often hidden. As the crew scrambles to battle stations, you and your small team of mates, often just a few apprentices or experienced hands, gather your most essential tools: axes for clearing wreckage, mallets for driving wedges, lead plates, oakum, and those long, wooden plugs called shot plugs. These plugs, of various sizes, are your first line of defense against incoming cannon fire. Each one is tapered, designed to be hammered into a shot hole from the inside, a desperate effort to staunch the flow of water when the enemy's iron balls begin to tear through the hull. It's like being a plumber, but the pipes are made of wood, and they're being ripped apart by bowling balls traveling at warp speed. You descend deeper, to the lowest decks, into the realm of the hold and the waterline. This is your true battleground. Your job during a broadside is grimly simple. Keep the ship afloat. While the gunners are trying to sink the enemy, you're trying to prevent your own ship from sinking. You are the ultimate damage control team, the last line of defense against the unforgiving ocean. The air down here is already growing thick, humid, and heavy with anticipation. The sounds from above are muffled, but you can feel the subtle sway of the ship, the increasing tension in its timbers. A common historical truth is that the ship's carpenter, despite not being directly involved in firing weapons, was one of the most crucial figures for a ship's survival in battle. A frigate might lose its mast or its sails and still fight, but if the hull was breached below the waterline and water rushed in unchecked, the ship was doomed. Your skills weren't about offensive power, they were about sheer, stubborn, defensive survival. You were literally holding the ship together with wood, sweat, and desperate hope. Here's a curious, little-known detail about the carpenter's preparations before battle. Many carpenters would take the time to prepare their most used tools with specific lanyards or ties, so they wouldn't be lost in the darkness and chaos. Imagine trying to find a dropped hammer when the deck is pitching violently, water is rushing in, and the ship is shuddering under cannon fire, all in near total darkness. Every second counted, and a lost tool could mean a lost ship. It's like having to perform open-heart surgery in the dark, with only one chance to pick up the right scalpel. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the true psychological toll on a carpenter during battle, particularly given their isolated and extremely dangerous position. While sailors on deck faced visible threats, the carpenter was in a confined space, hearing the terrifying sounds of impact but seeing little of the actual battle, yet knowing the fate of the entire ship rested on their ability to work under unimaginable pressure. Was the enclosed nature of their work more terrifying or less? Compared to the exposed decks, it's like trying to figure out if being stuck in a crumbling basement during a tornado is scarier than being outside watching it approach. The first jarring impact hits, a dull thud, felt deep in your bones as your ship's broadside unleashes its fury. The entire vessel shudders, groans, and then, almost immediately, the answering roar from the enemy. You brace yourself against a bulkhead, feeling the massive concussive force of the incoming cannonballs. The ship groans, timbers splinter, and suddenly, the familiar creaks of the vessel are replaced by agonizing screams of tortured wood. You know, with a sickening certainty, that your awful fate has begun. You felt that first sickening thud, the opening salvo in a symphony of destruction. Now, as our journey into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, you descend further into the belly of the beast, where your true, terrifying job begins tending to the hull, the ship's very lifeblood, and staunching the inevitable, catastrophic leaks. Imagine being inside a drum, and outside, giants are pounding it with hammers, while you're scrambling to patch holes with whatever you can find. The hull of a wooden warship was a marvel of engineering for its time, but it was also incredibly vulnerable, composed of countless thick oak planks, meticulously joined and caulked. It was designed to withstand the rigors of the sea, but it was never truly designed for the sheer, brutal impact of a 24-pound or 32-pound cannonball smashing through it at high velocity. Each cannonball, a solid sphere of iron, could tear a jagged, gaping hole, splintering massive timbers and sending deadly shards of wood flying through the confined spaces below deck. It was like a medieval bowling ball hitting a series of perfectly stacked Jenga blocks. Only each block was a foot thick and weighed a ton. Your position as carpenter, deep below the waterline, is the most critical for the ship's survival. While the gun crews on the upper decks are exchanging broadsides, dealing with smoke, fire, and flying splinters, you are in the dark, noisy, an increasingly wet hold, listening intently for the telltale sounds of damage. A dull thud followed by a rush of water, a violent shudder of the ship accompanied by a splintering crash. These are the grim cues that send you scrambling. You are literally the ship's emergency room surgeon. Only your patient is a 200-foot-long wooden beast, and it's bleeding water. The first direct hit below the waterline is always the worst. You hear it. A sickening crack, followed by a sudden violent hissing and gurgling as the sea rushes in. The air immediately turns cold and damp. You and your mates grab your pre-cut shot plugs, tapered wooden pegs of various sizes, and your heavy mallets. The darkness down here is profound, broken only by the dim, swaying glow of a few lanterns, which often get knocked over in the violent pitching of the ship. You have to feel your way, guided by the sound of rushing water and the frantic shouts of your comrades. Finding the hole in the chaos is a nightmare. Cannonballs rarely leave neat, round holes. Instead, they often create irregular, star-shaped breaches, or tear away entire sections of planking, sometimes leaving dangling splinters that resemble jagged teeth. You might have to fight your way through floating debris, dislodged cargo, or even the bodies of unfortunate sailors caught in the blast. The water level begins to rise, slowly at first, then with alarming speed, sloshing around your ankles, then your knees. Every moment spent searching is a moment more water floods into the ship, dragging her deeper. Once found, you have to work with incredible speed and brute force. You select a plug that seems to fit the general size of the hole, push it into the breach as best you can, and then, with all your might, hammer it in. The goal is not a perfect seal, but a temporary stopper to reduce the flow of water. It's a race against time, with the thundering cannons above, the shuddering ship, and the rising water all conspiring against you. You might need to drive in multiple plugs, or use larger sections of wood braced against the interior hull to patch larger ruptures. The pressure of the sea outside is immense, constantly trying to push your makeshift repairs back into the ship. A common historical truth is that the ship's carpenter often had to work in near total darkness and without much direct supervision once the battle began. They were effectively isolated in their dangerous work, relying on their training, their tools, and the frantic cooperation of their small team. Unlike the gun crews who could see the enemy and the progress of the battle, the carpenter's world was claustrophobic, filled with the internal sounds of the ship's agony. You were deafened by the roar of the cannons, but hyper-aware of every groan of timber, every splash of water. Here's a curious, little-known detail that highlights the improvisational nature of these repairs sometimes. When suitable wood plugs weren't immediately available, carpenters would use anything at hand to stuff a hole. This could include hammocks, spare clothing, pieces of sailcloth, or even, in extreme desperation, parts of their own uniforms, all designed to slow the water long enough for a more permanent patch to be applied. It's like trying to stop a burst pipe in your house with a roll of duct tape and a dish towel, but the pipe is the size of a dinner plate, and the water is coming from the Atlantic Ocean. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the actual effectiveness and longevity of these battlefield repairs. While a well-driven shot plug could certainly reduce the inflow of water, it was rarely a perfect seal. Was it truly enough to save a heavily damaged ship? Or did it merely buy precious minutes, allowing for an orderly surrender or abandonment? The success often depended on the size and location of the hole and the continued punishment the hull received. It's like trying to put a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it's just a delay tactic. As the battle rages above, your world below deck becomes a relentless cycle of finding holes, hammering in plugs, and bailing water. The ship might take on a noticeable list, indicating the accumulation of water in the hold. The sounds of cannon fire become louder, closer, indicating the enemy ship has maneuvered for another broadside. You feel the ship shudder again, a more violent impact this time, and a new, more powerful gush of water fills the space around you. You know, with a grim certainty, that your awful fate is far from over, and the very structure you're trying to save is slowly, painfully, bleeding out. You've just survived the initial onslaught, hammering futile plugs into gaping wounds below the waterline, the ship groaning like a dying beast around you. Now, as our terrifying journey into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, we ascend just slightly to the gun decks, where splinters fly, shrapnel rips, and sheer survival becomes your only focus, even as your work shifts. Imagine being inside a giant wooden drum being beaten by a dozen hammers, while sharp, deadly fragments are constantly exploding around you. As the battle intensifies, the primary objective of the enemy cannons isn't just to sink your ship by breaching the hull. They're also aiming for the gun decks, trying to disable the cannons, dismember the gun crews, and cause widespread destruction to the ship's structure above the waterline. This means that even if you've temporarily stemmed the flow of water below, your world above is about to become an absolute nightmare of flying wood and metal. A broadside from an enemy frigate is a truly horrifying thing to experience from inside a wooden ship. The sound alone is deafening, a thunderous roar as dozens of cannons fire almost simultaneously, followed by the terrifying crack as their iron projectiles slam into your ship's stout oak sides. Each impact sends a shudder through the entire vessel, vibrating through the deck beneath your feet, rattling your teeth, and making your very bones ache. You brace yourself against a bulkhead, trying to anticipate the next impact. But there's no real predicting where the next cannonball will strike. It's like being in a rock band's concert, but the music is pure destruction, and the instruments are tearing the venue apart. The most insidious and pervasive danger on the gun decks, and indeed throughout the ship's interior during a battle, is splintering. When a cannonball slams into the thick wooden hull, it doesn't just make a neat hole. It explodes the timber outwards and inwards, creating a deadly spray of razor-sharp wooden shards. These splinters can range from tiny, needle-like fragments that embed themselves painfully in your skin, to massive, dagger-sized chunks of wood that can rip through flesh, shatter bones, or even decapitate a man. Imagine being trapped inside a giant wooden box that's constantly being hit by a sledgehammer, and every impact turns the box itself into a weapon, showering you with deadly shrapnel. You, as the carpenter, are often called upon to move between the lowest decks and the gun decks, assessing damage, making emergency repairs to gun carriages, and reinforcing weakened bulkheads. As you move through the chaotic gun deck, the air is thick with acrid gunpowder smoke, stinging your eyes and burning your throat. The deck is slick with blood and water, making every step treacherous. Bodies, or parts of bodies, lie sprawled amidst the wrecked gun carriages and fallen rigging. The screams of the wounded mingle with the roars of the cannons and the shouts of the officers. It's an absolute hellscape, a cacophony of pain and destruction. Beyond splinters, you're also at risk from secondary projectiles. These aren't just pieces of your own ship. Sometimes, fragments of enemy cannonballs, grape shot, or even musket balls that have penetrated the hull can ricochet wildly through the confined spaces, becoming lethal, unpredictable missiles. The sheer concussive force of impacts can also dislodge heavy equipment, loose cannons, spare timbers, even men, sending them tumbling across the deck like deadly bowling pins. You're not just trying to patch holes. You're trying to dodge a constant, invisible storm of lethal debris. A common historical truth is that casualties from splinters often accounted for a higher percentage of injuries and deaths than direct cannonball hits during naval battles. A cannonball might kill 1 or 2 men, but the resulting explosion of splinters, could wound or kill a dozen others in its immediate vicinity. It was a silent, widespread killer, turning the very structure of the ship against its crew. It's like finding out that the biggest danger in a gunfight isn't the bullets, but the exploding pieces of the wall behind you. Here's a curious, little-known detail about the chaos of the gun deck, the extreme heat generated by repeated cannon fire and the muzzle flash. While the smoke obscured vision, the heat itself, combined with the lack of ventilation below deck, made the environment stifling and disorienting. Crewmen would often strip to the waist, slick with sweat and grime, adding to the grotesque tableau. This heat also softened the wood, making it more prone to splintering and less resistant to further impacts, creating a vicious cycle of destruction. Imagine fighting for your life in a sauna that's constantly being bombarded by explosives. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the true psychological effect of operating in such a confined, dark, and chaotically destructive environment. While accounts often focus on the bravery of the gun crews on the open decks, the Carpenter and their mates were working in a more claustrophobic, unpredictable, and arguably more terrifying space, where the ship itself seemed to be actively trying to kill them with its exploding timbers. Was the inability to see the enemy more frightening or less than facing them head-on? It's like trying to decide if it's scarier to fight a monster you can see or one you can only hear gnawing through your walls. Your job as the Carpenter shifts from preventing sinking to performing battlefield triage on the ship itself. You might be shoring up a collapsing deck or quickly fitting a temporary patch to a shattered bulkhead, all while trying to avoid the next deadly splinter. The air is thick with screams, the reek of blood and burnt powder, and the constant gut-wrenching shudder of your wooden world being torn apart around you. You're not just fixing the ship, you're living its agony, one shuddering, splintering impact at a time. Your awful fate just got a lot more immediate and brutally painful. You've narrowly dodged deadly splinters, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. Now, as our terrifying descent into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, you plunge into the most dreaded scenario of the flooding, a desperate and dark struggle against the relentless, unforgiving ocean. Imagine working frantically in waist-deep water, in near-total darkness, knowing that every moment the ship sinks further, dragging you down with it. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet, but the faucet is a gaping hole in your living room floor, and the water is the Atlantic Ocean pouring in. The roar of the cannons above is constant, but down in the hold, it's the sound of rushing water that truly dominates, a terrifying symphony of gurgling, hissing, and sloshing that signals the ship's impending doom. A direct hit below the waterline is bad enough, but repeated impacts, or a single massive breach, can quickly overwhelm any initial repairs. You hear the frantic shouts of water in the hold echoing through the decks, a universal cry of alarm that sends a shiver down the spine of every man aboard. Your first line of defense, those hastily hammered-in shot plugs, are only temporary. The immense pressure of the ocean outside, combined with the constant motion of the ship and the splintering of wood around the original damage, means that small trickles can quickly become powerful torrents. You and your mates are scrambling, not just to find new holes, but to reinforce existing patches that are threatening to burst. You might be jamming in more oakum or nailing lead sheets over larger damaged areas, trying to create a more robust, if still temporary, seal against the crushing power of the sea. The darkness down here is profound, with shattered lanterns and the constant churn of the ship. Even the few remaining light sources are unreliable, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. You are working almost entirely by feel, your hands slick with seawater, blood, and tar. The water level continues to rise relentlessly, first to your ankles, then your knees, then your waist. Every movement is a struggle, the heavy tools made heavier by the water's resistance. The air becomes heavy and humid, thick with the smell of damp wood, stagnant bilge, and the metallic tang of fear. It's like trying to complete a complex DIY project at the bottom of a swimming pool during an earthquake. And you're blindfolded. The fear is palpable, not just your own, but that of your small team and any unlucky souls trapped on the lowest decks. Panic can easily set in. Men might stumble, drop tools, or even be swept away by particularly strong inflows of water. Your leadership, your ability to stay calm and direct your mates amidst the chaos, is paramount. You are not just a carpenter, you are a lifeline, desperately trying to keep despair from overwhelming the grim task at hand. The ship's pumps, those massive, hand-operated contraptions, would be working furiously above. The rhythmic groans of the pumps, a desperate counterpoint to the relentless ingress of water. A common historical truth is that large-scale flooding below decks was almost impossible to fully stop during a heavy battle with the technology available. The best a carpenter could hope for was to slow the water enough to buy time for the ship to escape, time for the pumps to gain some advantage, or time for the crew to abandon ship. It was a holding action, a desperate delaying tactic against an inevitable end, rather than a true fix. You were effectively trying to put a cap on a fire hydrant with a thimble. Here's a curious, little-known detail that illustrates the desperate measures taken during flooding sometimes. If a cannonball had passed through the ship near a watertight bulkhead, and the hole was too large to plug, carpenters might attempt to build a cofferdam around the breach. This involved quickly constructing a temporary wooden box or barrier around the hole on the inside of the hull, then constantly bailing water out of this small enclosure, preventing it from flooding the rest of the ship. This was an incredibly difficult and often dangerous task, requiring speed, skill, and an almost superhuman effort in the middle of a battle. Imagine trying to build a tiny, temporary dam inside your rapidly sinking canoe. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the practical effectiveness of relying on shot plugs and emergency repairs versus simply accepting the inevitable sinking once severe flooding began. Was it a truly viable strategy, or merely a testament to the sheer tenacity and refusal to surrender on the part of the carpenters? How many ships that were saved by these repairs truly avoided sinking later? Once the pressure of battle was off, it's like arguing whether a single bucket is truly effective against a tsunami, or if it just makes you feel like you're doing something. As the water continues to rise, sloshing against your chest, you feel the ship beginning to list more severely. The pumps above are still groaning, but the grim reality of their losing battle echoes through the wooden structure. Your muscles ache, your lungs burn from the exertion in the thick, humid air. Every movement is a Herculean effort, with a cold certainty that if the battle doesn't end soon, or if a decisive blow isn't struck against the enemy, your awful fate will be sealed, not by a cannonball, but by the slow, suffocating embrace of the deep, cold ocean. You're now battling the relentless ocean, the water rising around you as the ship takes a terrifying list. Now, as our harrowing descent into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, you find yourself engaged in makeshift repairs, a grim determination against overwhelming, relentless odds. This isn't about perfectly crafted joints or carefully planned timbers. It's about brute force, desperate improvisation, and the sheer will to keep a dying Leviathan breathing. Imagine being a first responder, but your ambulance is rapidly filling with water, and you're patching it with duct tape and prayer. The initial rush of cannonballs might have created clear, albeit jagged, holes. But as the battle rages, the repeated impacts, the shuddering of the ship, and the stress on its weakened structure lead to more insidious damage. Planks groan and split along their seams. Bulkheads crack. The very internal skeleton of the ship begins to shift and deform under the immense strain. Your job, as the carpenter, is no longer just plugging holes. It's about shoring up collapsing sections, reinforcing stressed timbers, and preventing the entire vessel from disintegrating around you. Your tools, once precise instruments, become blunt weapons of desperate necessity. An axe isn't just for shaping wood, it's for hacking away splintered debris. A mallet isn't just for driving pegs, it's for pounding massive wedges into cracking timbers, trying to brace them against the collapsing pressure. You might be using spare spars, broken gun carriages, or even dismantled furniture, anything that can provide temporary structural support. The beauty of careful craftsmanship is replaced by the raw ugliness of emergency brute force. It's like being a surgeon who has to operate with a butter knife and a spoon because the proper instruments were blown away. The challenges are immense. The darkness is oppressive, broken only by the flickering light of lanterns that dance wildly with every shudder of the ship. The air is thick with smoke, sweat, and the pungent smell of bilge. The constant concussive blasts from the cannons above deafen you, making communication a shouted, desperate affair. The deck beneath your feet is slick with seawater, blood, and debris, making every movement treacherous. You might stumble, fall, and lose precious moments. Or worse, lose a vital tool in the murky, rising water. You might be called upon to address a shattered mast, its base splintered, threatening to bring the entire heavy structure crashing down onto the decks below. Or perhaps a gun carriage has been destroyed, its heavy cannon now loose and rolling dangerously across the pitching deck, threatening to crush any man in its path. Your immediate task is to secure it, to prevent further damage, often by lashing it down with heavy ropes or jury-rigging temporary wooden chocks. This requires incredible strength, agility, and a terrifying speed, often in the path of other flying debris. A common historical truth is that ship's carpenters were often expected to work until they were literally incapacitated or dead. Their role was so vital to the ship's survival that they could not afford to stop, to rest, or to seek cover. Their dedication, often to the very last moment, speaks volumes about the incredible fortitude and sense of duty that characterized these men. They were like the ship's heart, pumping blood into its veins, refusing to stop even when the arteries were severed. Here's a curious, little-known detail that illustrates the extremity of these repairs sometimes. When a large section of the hull was gone, carpenters would attempt to create a bolstering or fathering patch from the outside of the ship, if conditions permitted. This involved lowering a large piece of sailcloth or a mat, sometimes stuffed with oakum, over the side of the ship, and trying to pull it over the hole, letting the water pressure push it against the breach. While incredibly risky and difficult in the middle of a battle, it was a desperate attempt to slow a massive inflow of water. Imagine trying to put a giant bandage on a moving, exploding whale. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the extent to which these desperate, makeshift repairs truly saved ships versus simply prolonging their inevitable demise. While accounts exist of ships that miraculously survived incredible damage, it's also true that many were eventually lost despite the carpenters' valiant efforts. Was their work a true turning point in many battles, or more often a heroic, but ultimately futile, delaying action against overwhelming force? It's like asking if a desperate last-ditch effort truly won the game, or if it just made the final score look a little better. As you hammer, brace, and lash, your muscles scream in protest. Your breath comes in ragged gasps. The ship continues to shudder, groan, and list, a constant reminder of its agony. You are soaked to the bone, your face streaked with sweat, grime, and perhaps blood. The constant roar of the cannons and the splintering impacts blend into a nightmarish din. You know, with every fiber of your being, that your awful fate is intricately tied to the fate of this battered, bleeding wooden leviathan, and your only option is to keep fighting to fix it until your last breath. You've patched, hammered, and shored, battling the sea as much as the enemy. Now, as our agonizing journey into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle plumbs the depths of despair, we descend into the orlop deck, a bloody retreat that transforms into a makeshift hospital, a place of horrific suffering and grim choices. Imagine stepping from the chaos of splintered timber into a dimly lit chamber overflowing with broken bodies, where your tools might shift from wood to flesh. It's like going from a construction site during a demolition to an emergency room in a disaster zone. But the disaster is still ongoing, and you're trapped below ground. The orlop deck was typically the lowest deck within the hull that still had enough headroom for crewmen to stand, usually just above the waterline. In peacetime, it might be used for storage or as a relatively quiet space for off-duty sailors. But in battle, this dark, cramped, and often poorly ventilated space was designated as the cockpit, the ship's surgical and medical station. Here, the ship's surgeon and his mates would attempt to treat the horrific injuries inflicted by cannon fire, splinters, and musket balls. It was a place where human suffering reached its most visceral, agonizing peak. As the carpenter, your primary duties keep you near the hull, but the orlop deck is where the ship's most grievously wounded are brought. You hear their screams, their groans, their desperate pleas for water or mercy, even over the constant roar of the cannons. The air down here, already heavy with the smell of damp wood and powder smoke, quickly becomes thick with the coppery tang of blood, sweat, and the pungent odor of unwashed bodies and fear. It's a sensory assault that drills into your very soul. You might be called to the orlop deck for a very specific and utterly grim task to assist the surgeon with amputations. Cannonballs didn't just break bones, they often shattered limbs beyond repair, leaving mangled flesh and splintered bone. The only way to save a life in such circumstances was often a swift amputation. The surgeon, working with crude, unsterilized instruments, would need strong, steady hands to hold the patient down, to tourniquet a limb, or even to saw through bone. Your experience with wood, with cutting and shaping, might ironically be pressed into service for this most awful of tasks, holding a limb steady or helping to fashion a makeshift splint from broken timber. Imagine being asked to help saw off a piece of a human being while the very structure around you is being ripped apart. The scene on the orlop deck is one of unimaginable horror. Wounded men are laid out on makeshift cots or simply on the deck, often side by side, their injuries ghastly in the flickering lamplight. Limbs might be missing, bodies torn open, faces disfigured. The surgeon, often overworked and overwhelmed, might have to make agonizing choices, deciding who was salvageable and who was beyond hope. The groans of the dying, the prayers of the pious, and the stoic silence of those in shock create a symphony of human misery. It's like the worst nightmare you could ever conjure, but it's utterly real, and you're a reluctant participant. A common historical truth is that infection was a far greater killer than the initial injury itself in naval battles. Even if a sailor survived a cannonball wound or an amputation, the lack of sterile conditions, antibiotics, and understanding of germ theory meant that gangrene, sepsis, and other infections were almost inevitable. Many who survived the battle died days or weeks later from these secondary complications. The orlop deck might save you from the immediate cannon fire, but it was often a waiting room for a slower, more agonizing demise. Here's a curious, little-known detail about the orlop deck during battle. It was often the safest place on the ship from direct cannon fire. Paradoxically, because it was so low within the hull, cannonballs aimed at the upper decks or waterline would often pass over it. However, This safety came at a terrible price. It meant you were enclosed, claustrophobic, and subjected to the sounds of destruction without the visual context. And of course, if the hull was breached below the orlop, it became a death trap. It was like being in the eye of a hurricane, but the eye was filled with blood and screams. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the ethical and psychological burden placed on those, like carpenters, who had to shift between their primary duties and assisting in such gruesome medical operations. Did it desensitize them, or did it leave them with lasting trauma? How did men reconcile their work of building and repairing with the sudden, necessary work of destroying and witnessing such profound suffering? It's like asking if a combat engineer, trained to build bridges, can truly be unaffected when they're suddenly asked to destroy one, knowing people are still on it. As you stand on the orlop deck, surrounded by the moans of the dying and the reek of raw flesh, your senses are overwhelmed. The ship continues its violent shuddering, each impact a reminder that death is still raining down from above, and the possibility of the orlop deck itself becoming a watery grave is ever present. Your awful fate now includes bearing witness to the very worst of human suffering, a silent internal wound that may never heal, even if your ship somehow survives. You've witnessed the grim horrors of the orlop deck, a tableau of human suffering beneath the chaos of battle. Now, as our terrifying journey into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, you confront an even more insidious enemy fire below, a blazing nightmare in a wooden coffin. Imagine the worst fear of any sailor realized flames erupting in the heart of a timber vessel, deep within its confines, threatening to consume everything. It's like being trapped in a burning building, but the building is made of kindling and floating on an ocean of fuel. The relentless cannon fire isn't just about punching holes, it's also about creating havoc. And sometimes, that havoc includes fire. When a cannonball rips through a deck, or smashes into a powder magazine, even a small one, or when a lantern is knocked over amid spilled gunpowder, sparks can ignite the highly flammable materials that make up a wooden warship. Below decks, where ventilation is poor and wooden structures are everywhere, a small flame can quickly become an unstoppable inferno. You, as the carpenter, are intimately familiar with every inch of wood on this ship. You know its vulnerabilities, its dry spots, its ancient timbers that would catch fire like tinder. The initial smell of smoke, subtle at first, then rapidly growing thicker and acrid, sends a new wave of terror through you. This isn't just about water. This is about being roasted alive or suffocating in a burning inferno. The cry of fire buoy below decks is often met with a different kind of panic than water in the hold. Water might sink you slowly, but fire below can consume you instantly. Your tools, once used for repair, might now be turned to desperate firefighting. Axes could be used to chop away burning sections of bulkhead to create fire breaks, isolating the blaze before it spreads. Buckets of water, usually scarce below decks during battle, would be frantically passed hand to hand in a futile attempt to douse the flames. The air becomes impossibly hot, searing your lungs with every breath, and the smoke, thick and black, chokes you, obscuring what little light remains. It's like trying to fight a raging bonfire with a Dixie cup, while the walls around you are actively combusting. The danger from fire below decks is multifaceted. Firstly, there's the direct threat of being burned alive. Secondly, the smoke itself is lethal, rapidly causing suffocation and disorientation. Thirdly, and perhaps most terrifyingly, is the risk of the fire reaching the ship's magazine, where hundreds of barrels of gunpowder are stored. A magazine explosion would instantly vaporize the ship and everyone aboard, turning the wooden Leviathan into a spectacular, but utterly final, mushroom cloud. You know that if the fire gets close to that part of the ship, Your fate is sealed, and there won't be a piece left of you to find. A common historical truth is that magazine explosions were the most catastrophic end for a warship during battle, more so than simple sinking. Many ships that were thought to be invincible were obliterated in an instant when a lucky shot or an uncontrolled fire reached their powder. This fear was always at the back of every sailor's mind, a constant silent dread lurking beneath the decks. It's like knowing there's a ticking time bomb in your basement, and any moment it could just go off. Here's a curious, little-known detail about preventing magazine explosions. The magazine itself was designed with extreme precautions. It was usually located deep within the hull, below the waterline, and surrounded by thick timber to provide some protection. Furthermore, it was often equipped with a system to wet the magazine, a means to flood the powder room with seawater, a desperate last resort to prevent an explosion if fire threatened. Imagine the horrifying decision: flood your own ship with seawater to save it from blowing up, potentially making it easier for the enemy to sink you later. But at least you wouldn't be instantly atomized. It's the ultimate damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the frequency of shipboard fires being the direct cause of a ship's loss versus contributing to a general weakening and demoralization that led to surrender or abandonment. While spectacular magazine explosions are well documented, many smaller fires might have simply made a ship uninhabitable or made repairs impossible, forcing its crew to give up. Was fire the ultimate destroyer, or often just a particularly nasty complication? It's like asking if the house burned down because of the fire, or because the fire made it impossible to fight off the burglars who then ransacked it. As the smoke burns your eyes and lungs, and the heat rises around you, your resolve is tested to its absolute limit. The fight against the fire is a lonely, desperate one, often separate from the main battle above. You're cut off, surrounded by the inferno you're trying to contain, knowing that failure means an unspeakably horrific end. Your awful fate, once confined to patching holes, has now expanded to include the agonizing prospect of being incinerated from the inside out, trapped in a burning wooden coffin. You've battled fire and water, a grim fight against the very elements that compose your wooden world. Now, as our terrifying descent into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle continues, you face the most terrifying realization: trapped, despair in the depths. Imagine the ship taking on a severe list, the sounds of battle fading, replaced by the ominous rush of water and the creaking agony of a vessel tearing itself apart. You are deep inside, below decks, and the exits are gone, or blocked, or simply too far away. It's like being in a sinking submarine, but the walls are made of wood, and the oxygen is running out. As the battle progresses, a ship can sustain catastrophic damage. Masts might fall, bringing tons of rigging and spars crashing onto the deck. Decks themselves can collapse under repeated cannon fire, and most terrifying for those below, the hull can deform or splinter in such a way that it blocks escape routes. Ladders might be shattered, hatchways jammed by falling debris, or passages filled with water or smoke. Your world, once navigable even in darkness, becomes a labyrinth of wreckage and despair. You might be deep in the hold, trying to patch a particularly bad breach, when a massive impact rocks the ship, louder and more violent than anything before. Above you, you hear the sickening roar of falling timber, the cries of men, and then a sudden horrifying silence from the deck directly above. You try to ascend, but the ladder is gone, or a mountain of shattered wood has fallen, completely blocking the way. The realization hits you like a cold wave. You are trapped. Your battle station, designed to save the ship, has become your tomb. The feeling of being trapped below decks is uniquely horrifying. You can hear the sounds of the dying battle above, perhaps the screams of your shipmates, or the shouts of the enemy as they prepare to board, but you are utterly cut off. You are helpless, unable to fight, unable to assist, unable to even see your fate. Your world shrinks to the immediate, dark, and increasingly claustrophobic space around you, filled with the ominous sounds of a dying ship. It's like being buried alive, but your coffin is also trying to drag you to the bottom of the ocean. As the ship takes on more water, or if a fire continues to rage, the conditions below deck become unbearable. The air grows stale and heavy, eventually filled with the choking smoke from internal fires, or the noxious gases from stagnant bilge water. The rising water is icy cold, sapping your strength and chilling you to the bone. Every creak and groan of the ship's timbers sounds like a death knell, each shudder a final spasm of the dying vessel. The ship, which was once your home and your responsibility, is now actively working against you, its very structure becoming a trap. A common historical truth is that many sailors trapped below decks likely drowned or suffocated without ever seeing the sky again. In the chaos of battle, with hundreds of men fighting for survival, those trapped in the lower compartments were often forgotten, their desperate cries unheard above the din of war. Their deaths were silent, unseen, and unrecorded in the official battle logs that focused on the glory of victory or the tragedy of the visible casualties. They simply vanished into the depths with their ship. Here's a curious, little-known detail that highlights the psychological horror of this predicament sometimes. Survivors reported hearing the desperate cries of those trapped below deck, even after a ship had seemingly been abandoned or was clearly sinking. Imagine making it to the surface, gasping for air, only to hear the muffled, hopeless screams of your shipmates still trapped inside the water-filled hull, slowly fading as the ship disappears beneath the waves. It's a haunting sound that would stay with a survivor for the rest of their days, a grim reminder of those left behind. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the extent to which these trapped deaths were truly unavoidable versus a consequence of the desperate and chaotic nature of naval warfare. Were there more opportunities for rescue that simply weren't taken due to the overriding priority of battle? Or was it truly an impossible situation for those caught in the most damaged parts of the ship? It's like arguing if someone truly couldn't escape a burning building, or if the panic and smoke simply obscured their path to safety. As the water closes in around you, your tools, once symbols of hope and repair, become useless burdens. The sounds of the world above fade into a distant rumble, replaced by the terrifying gurgle of the sea claiming its prize. You are alone, in the dark, with the cold embrace of the ocean steadily rising, and the agonizing knowledge that your awful fate is now to become part of the ship itself, dragged down into the silent, eternal depths. You've faced the claustrophobic dread of being trapped, the water rising, the silence deepening. Now, as our harrowing descent into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle reaches its penultimate stage, you confront the desperate, often chaotic struggle of abandoning ship, a last, cold hope. Imagine the final desperate scramble, not for victory, but for mere survival, as your once mighty wooden world begins its irreversible plunge into the abyss. It's like being on a roller coaster that's derailed and is plummeting towards a very cold, wet, and uncertain landing. The order to abandon ship is not given lightly. It's the ultimate admission of defeat, a devastating blow to morale, signifying that all hope of saving the vessel is lost. For you, the carpenter, who has fought so valiantly to keep the ship alive, it's a particularly bitter pill to swallow. All your desperate repairs, all your sweat and effort are now rendered meaningless. The battle against the enemy has ended, replaced by a brutal, every man for himself struggle against the sea. The scene on a sinking warship during abandonment is one of utter chaos and primal fear. Men, many of them wounded, scramble towards the upper decks, desperate for a chance to escape. The ship might be listing severely, making every step treacherous. Smoke might still be pouring from below, or water might be surging across the decks. There's a frantic clamor as men try to launch lifeboats, chop away masts to prevent them from dragging the ship down, or simply grab onto any piece of floating debris. It's a terrifying stampede, with limited pathways to freedom. As the Carpenter, you might be among the last to leave your battle station below, having fought to save the ship until the very last moment. Your tools, once your lifeblood, are now abandoned as you scramble upwards. You might find yourself having to cut away damaged rigging or splintered spars to clear a path, or to free a stuck lifeboat. Your skills, honed for construction and repair, now become crucial for demolition and escape. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? The very craft that defined you is now about aiding in the destruction of your world, simply to save your own skin. Reaching the deck is only the beginning of a new nightmare. The enemy ships, if the battle is still ongoing, or if they have won, might continue to fire at the sinking vessel or at the men struggling in the water. The sea itself is a formidable foe, cold, unforgiving, and vast. Many sailors could not swim, and those who could were quickly exhausted in the rough waves, often hampered by heavy clothing and injuries. Lifeboats were few and often damaged, quickly overloaded by desperate men. It was a race against the clock, against the cold, against drowning, and sometimes against enemy muskets. A common historical truth is that death by drowning was a common fate for sailors abandoning a sinking ship. Even if they escaped the immediate battle, hypothermia in the cold North Atlantic, exhaustion, or simply being pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship claimed countless lives. The image of men clinging to wreckage, slowly succumbing to the elements, is a grim counterpoint to the glory often associated with naval victories. It's like surviving a fiery car crash, only to realize you've landed in a freezing, shark-infested ocean. Here's a curious, little-known detail that highlights the desperation of abandonment sometimes. When lifeboats were not available or were too damaged, sailors would resort to creating makeshift rafts from whatever loose timber or spars they could find. These crude rafts offered little protection from the elements, but provided a temporary platform to stay out of the water. Imagine frantically lashing together splintered bits of wood, knowing that your life depends on its flimsy buoyancy. It's the ultimate DIY project under extreme duress. And this leads us to an important academic debate. Historians still debate the effectiveness of naval abandonment procedures during this era. Were they truly organized, or did they typically devolve into pure anarchy? How many lives were genuinely saved by these efforts, versus those who simply delayed an inevitable drowning? The human element of panic and self-preservation often trumped any pre-battle plans, making orderly escape incredibly challenging. It's like asking if a fire drill truly prepares everyone for a real fire, or if chaos always takes over when the stakes are real. As you plunge into the icy water, the ship, your home, your battlefield, lets out a final agonizing groan, then slips beneath the waves, taking with it the echoes of its last battle and the souls of those who couldn't escape. You're alone in the vast, cold ocean, clinging to a piece of wreckage, the sounds of battle fading, replaced by the endless slap of waves and your own ragged breathing. Your awful fate has brought you to the brink, utterly at the mercy of the sea. You've fought the ship's agony, the rising waters, the engulfing smoke, and the final desperate plunge into the ocean. Now, As our harrowing journey into the awful fate of a ship's carpenter during a sea battle concludes, we look beyond the immediate chaos to the silent sea's embrace, reflecting on the carpenter's forgotten, awful fate, and the enduring legacy of men like you who served below decks. Imagine the vast, indifferent ocean finally claiming its prize, and the quiet, unseen sacrifice of those who fought to the bitter end. If you were one of the unlucky ones, your awful fate ended with the ship itself, pulled down by the suction of the sinking vessel, entangled in rigging, or simply succumbing to exhaustion and the frigid cold. Your final moments would have been spent in the dark, crushing embrace of the sea. There would be no heroic last stand on deck, no flag-waving glory, just the silent descent into the abyss, your body becoming one with the shattered timbers you had so desperately tried to save. It's like being dragged under by a whirlpool, your efforts to swim futile against the overwhelming force of the ocean. Even if you managed to escape the sinking ship, your ordeal was far from over. Drifting on a piece of wreckage, or crammed into an overcrowded, leaking lifeboat, you would face the elements. The vast, indifferent ocean offered no mercy. Hypothermia, in the cold waters of the Atlantic, could claim lives in mere hours. Thirst and starvation would set in quickly if rescue wasn't swift. The mental toll of having witnessed such horrors, of having fought so hard, only to lose your ship and your mates, would linger, a haunting specter, even if your body survived. The sea might have released you, but it would have left an indelible mark on your soul. For those who did survive and were rescued, either by their own side or taken as prisoners by the enemy, the memory of the battle, and particularly their subterranean struggle, would never fade. They would carry the sounds of splintering wood, the screams of the wounded on the orlop deck, the choking smell of smoke, and the chilling feel of rising water with them for the rest of their lives. The awful fate of the ship's carpenter wasn't just about dying, it was about living through hell in the dark, isolated belly of a dying beast. The legacy of these ship's carpenters is often an unsung one. History books tend to focus on the captains, the gunners, the officers who commanded the ships and led the charges. But without the carpenters, without their tireless, dangerous work below decks, many of those glorious naval victories would have been impossible or turned into devastating defeats. They were the silent backbone of the fleet, the vital engineers whose grim determination often stood between triumph and tragedy. They were the ship's quiet heroes, doing the dirty work that no one saw, but everyone depended on. A common historical truth is that the survival rates for those working below decks were often lower than for those on the open gun decks, despite not being directly exposed to enemy fire. This was due to the combined dangers of flooding, fire, collapsing timbers, and the difficulty of escape once severe damage occurred. The very place designed to offer protection became a death trap when the ship itself began to break apart. It's like finding out that the safest place to be during a house fire is actually the basement, but only until the basement fills with smoke and collapses on you. Here's a curious, little-known detail that speaks to the carpenter's unique connection to their vessel. Many carpenters formed a profound bond with their ship, almost as if it were a living entity. They knew its flaws, its strengths, its individual quirks better than almost anyone else aboard. To watch their ship die, to fight for its very life, and then to be forced to abandon it, must have been a deeply traumatic and personal loss, far beyond just losing a piece of property. It's like a doctor losing a patient they had cared for their entire career, but the patient was also their home. And this leads us to a final, profound academic debate. Historians still debate the true psychological cost of serving as a carpenter in a major naval battle. While physical injuries were evident, The unique combination of isolation, constant proximity to the ship's structural agony, and the knowledge that the ultimate fate of hundreds of lives rested on their unseen work must have created an extraordinary mental burden. Did the constant exposure to raw, mechanical destruction, without the catharsis of direct combat, lead to a different kind of trauma than that experienced by other sailors? It's like asking if the trauma of being a bomb disposal expert is different from being a frontline soldier. Both are terrifying, but in profoundly different ways. As you close your eyes, the sounds of cannon fire fade, replaced by the soft hum of your fan. The cold, dark embrace of the sea recedes, leaving only the quiet of your room. The awful fate of the ship's Carpenter is a testament to the unseen heroism, the brutal realities, and the forgotten sacrifices that underpin the grand narratives of naval history. Their story reminds us that even in the most chaotic moments, there are those quietly, desperately keeping the world from falling apart.